How many people stop reading the Book of Mormon when they get to the long block of Isaiah in 2nd Nephi? If Nephi's intent was to persuade people to come into Christ, why would he put a stumbling block in his story just when it was getting good? There's actually a very good reason. Remember when Nephi said that he was constrained by the Spirit to say no more about the last days? Being obedient, he did stop prophesying, but then he came upon something in the brass plates that spoke of these things for him. He came to a section of Isaiah that not only laid out the events of the last days, but laid them out in a chronological order so that those who read them could prepare for the last days. In those 13 chapters 2 through 14, Isaiah gives us a timeline of the very last days, those days just before the Lord comes in his majesty to the world. This stumbling block is actually one of the great gifts of God to his people in the last days. So let's look at that timeline. It starts in chapter 2, which is chapter 12 in 2nd Nephi. We learn that all the proud will be humbled by a terrifying earthquake. This earthquake will be so destructive that it will cause even wealthy people to hide in the mountains and give their gold to any fool who will sell food to them. Then the earthquake is mentioned again, possibly implying a second, even greater earthquake. Immediately following these shakings of the earth, chapter 3 tells us that food and water will grow scarce. It seems that roads will become impassable and water mains will be severed, and those who don't have food and water will have to take it from others. Chapter 3 speaks of people gathering into clans for protection, because desperate people will be willing to kill them for what they have. It even says that many men of the covenant will die in this war, and that the daughters of Zion will live in awful and primitive conditions. Chapter 4 suggests that so many men will be killed that multiple women will want to marry the same man, possibly for protection. But then we learn something else. A righteous branch of the covenant people will begin to create Zion, where God will protect them. This will be, quote, a place of refuge, a covert from the warfare raging around them. Next in the timeline, in chapter 5, we learn why God has allowed this to happen, because so many of his children love Babylon more than his gospel. God is humbling them by breaking down their hedge of protection. He's drying up their blessings. Drought will kill their crops. He even says that it would be better to eat the seeds than to plant them. Then, in an ominous shift, the Lord says through Isaiah that he will call a powerful army from the end of the earth. This army will be led by a wicked ensign, and his invading army will be swift and unstoppable, and also, as we find out, merciless. Chapter 6 is unique. It's Isaiah's call to be a prophet. But why is it here, rather than at the beginning of his book? Because, and this is important, because that's when it will happen in the timeline. Isaiah is using his call as a prophet as a type of the righteous ensign being called and anointed by God. Like Isaiah, this righteous servant will speak hard things, things that can't be accepted except on faith. His words will confound the wicked, even in the kingdom. A sort of chaos may come of this, again, even in the kingdom. And when will this confusion end? According to Isaiah, not until the land is made utterly desolate and the cities are empty. Chapter 7 tells us that the Lord will raise two armies, the flies of Egypt and the bees of Assyria. The flies of Egypt represent the army of the superpower in the last days, almost certainly America. And the bees of Assyria represent an invading army. This invading army, led by the wicked ensign, will prevail. And even still, in many ways, the terrible destructions have just begun. Chapter 8 tells us that the people who refuse the waters of Shiloh, or the protection of the covenant, will drown in the floods of the Assyrian. Those who turn away from the covenant will be broken in pieces. Many apostates will even be tempted to follow spiritualists, but if they do, they will be, quote, driven to darkness, leading many of them to eventually curse their God and die. Chapter 9 tells us that despite the destruction of the wicked and rebellious, the righteous people will see a great light in Zion and be filled with joy. The wicked who survive, however, will suffer terribly. In fearsome fighting between them, no man will spare his brother, and some, we're told, will even eat the flesh of their own arms. Chapter 10 speaks of more devastation, more destruction. Then, finally, when, quote, the Lord hath performed his whole work upon Mount Zion, end quote, when he humbles the covenant people until they bend the knee to his will, then he will begin to punish the Assyrian and his armies. Covenant survivors will flee to safety, while the wicked survivors will continue their reign of terror around the world. Chapter 11 speaks of the branch, the righteous servant who was anointed in chapter 6. This ensign will literally have power to smite the earth and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Nothing will stop him as he gathers the righteous and humble from their four corners of the earth. This righteous servant will exercise great power and even cause millennial conditions to flourish in Zion. And he will create a holy highway for the converted tribes of Israel to travel to Zion. Chapter 12 is a song of praise to be sung by the inhabitants of Zion at this time. God is their salvation, and they rejoice, knowing they will draw from the living water of Christ's presence. For he, in fact, will dwell with them. Chapter 13 prophesies of terrible battles worldwide that will finally destroy Babylon. Now that the Lord has gathered in his, quote, sanctified ones to Zion, he'll bring the armies of the world together to, quote, destroy the whole land. A man will become scarcer than fine gold. The heavens will shake, and, quote, the earth will remove out of her place. The carnage will be terrible, and Babylon, quote, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 14 brings us to the end of the timeline. Babylon is destroyed and the whole earth is at rest, except for a final accounting of the wicked ensign, the Assyrian king who wrought such terrible destruction on the earth. When he dies, all hell will be moved to meet him. Like Lucifer, this tyrant will fall into the deepest abyss. The Lord will even cut off his posterity from mortality. But finally, we're told that, quote, the Lord hath founded Zion, and she shall never fear again. In these 13 chapters, Isaiah has given us a great gift, and Nephi placed these chapters in his book for a very wise purpose, to give us specifics, to let the righteous know where they are in the trying times to come, to let those who have eyes to see actually see what is happening and why. Rather than skip this long block of Isaiah, we should embrace it. We should test it. We should learn from it. If we do so, we'll be able to prepare ourselves for something that many of us never saw coming. Now, if you'd like to learn more about Isaiah's timeline for the last days and his specific prophecies for us today, check out the website, thewordsofisaiah.com. I'm Curtis Taylor with The Words of Isaiah.